Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where I sometimes have a background and sometimes don't. I don't know what's going on. I'm just trying things out. Felt like maybe a background would make it, I don't know, for some reason, less distracting, all the stuff that's going on in the back. Who knows, but I actually kind of like the distracting stuff in the back myself. Visually more entertaining. For me, I don't know about y'all, some people complain about some OCD problems with counting or whatever, but I have the same issues, but maybe not the counting thing. Very weird weather in Los Angeles lately. We've been getting quite a bit of rain, which is good. It has gotten seems to be fluctuating cold and hot. It was supposed to be very cold all week, but all of a sudden yesterday it was clear skies. So this happens every time in Los Angeles, that there's clear skies. It just doesn't matter wherever the temperature starts, it just goes straight up very, very quickly, which I don't know what the mechanism is that's causing that, but it got extremely hot yesterday all of a sudden, and it's so hot that there were lots of planes in the sky making stuff happen. That's all I got to say about that. But you know, in the morning it was very clear, very beautiful blue skies, and by the mid-afternoon it was just milky white haze, which was not natural. It was not a marine layer. It was it was created. Today, cloudy, naturally cloudy, but also very warm. As I drove past my favorite thermometer down the street, it was 80 degrees. And when the forecast for the entire week is in the 60s, that's a lot to be off by. So I don't know what's going on. And I don't think the weathermen do either, or weather people, excuse me. But getting back into more climate change news from the Washington Post. This is from yesterday. The Arctic's carbon bomb might be even more potent than we thought. For some time, scientists, fearing the mass release of greenhouse gases from the carbon-rich frozen soils of the Arctic, have had at least one morsel of good news in their forecasts. They predicted most of the gas released would be carbon dioxide, which, though a greenhouse gas, drives warming more slowly than some other gases. Scientists obviously weren't excited about more carbon dioxide emissions, but it was better than the alternative, methane, a shorter-lived but far harder-hitting gas that could cause faster bursts of warming. Now even that silver lining is in doubt. Research released Monday suggests that methane releases could be considerably more prevalent as Arctic permafrost thaws. The research finds that in waterlogged wetland soils where oxygen is not prevalent, tiny microorganisms will produce a considerable volume of methane, a gas that doesn't last in the air much more than a decade, but has a warming effect many times that of carbon dioxide over a period of 100 years. What we can definitely say is that the importance of methane was underestimated until now in the carbon studies, said Christian Knobloch, a researcher at the Universitat Hamburg in Germany. I hope I'm saying that right. I have no idea. And the lead author of the study, published in Nature Climate Change. The divergent finding came after Knobloch and his colleagues conducted a lengthy experiment more than 7 years long, monitoring patches of submerged and artificially warmed soil from Siberia in the laboratory, and gradually seeing sensitive methane-producing microorganisms become more prevalent over time. Knobloch contends that other studies have not examined waterlogged Arctic soils for as long, and he notes that in some cases it took 3 years or more for the methane-generating microorganisms to really get cranking. What we saw is that it takes a very long time until methane starts being produced. And the study that we did is really the first one, which is so long, Knobloch said. The research was conducted along with with colleagues from several institutions in Germany, Sweden, and Russia. So much methane was produced in the experiment, the researchers calculated that the impact of greenhouse gas emissions from wet soils or wetlands will be higher than from drier soils, where carbon dioxide should indeed be the top gas released. This finding, if further confirmed, could reorient calculations of the overall potential of permafrost to worsen global warming over the coming century. For instance, one major study of permafrost warming potential, published in 2015 in the journal Nature, played down the potential for methane release in wet soils, saying drier soils would be the bigger problem. In spite of the more potent greenhouse gas, CH4, a unit of newly thawed permafrost carbon could have a greater impact on climate over a century if it thaws and decomposes within a drier aerobic soil as compared to an equivalent amount of carbon within a waterlogged soil or sediment, that research found. The new study would appear to contradict this, but Knobloch cautions that more research would have to be done to go from these results to a forecast for just how much methane could waft from permafrost in the coming decades. It will be important to know, for instance, how much thawed permafrost will be stuck in watery conditions versus dry ones. One Arctic permafrost expert One Arctic permafrost expert not involved in the research, Merit Turetsky of the University of Guelph, praised the new study, noting that researchers had spent a long time trying to uncover the behavior of tiny methane-producing organisms in watery soil. The research, she said, could help bridge the gap between field studies of waterlogged permafrost that have detected methane emissions and laboratory studies that have seemed to play down the importance of the gas. What's remarkable about this study is the length of time they spent tracking the communities, and I think that offers a potential reason for why field and lab studies have disagreed with each other, Turetsky said. She said the total amount of permafrost carbon that could be vulnerable because of global warming during this century, perhaps 10% of it, which could be more than enough to undermine global climate goals, probably won't change in light of the new research. But the fraction of that carbon that is emitted as methane as opposed to carbon dioxide will be crucial, she said, and remains to be determined. We absolutely have to partition that total permafrost carbon release into those two forms because it really matters, Turetsky said. So I think that has got to be where the community goes next. But Royson Comain, a research associate at Harvard, who studies the Arctic atmosphere and also was not involved in this research, was more skeptical about relying on the study to assume a worse verdict about methane. The study was very nicely done, she said, but the tendency of wet soils to produce methane could be counteracted by several factors. The soils could also become host to organisms that devour the methane and turn it into carbon dioxide. And as the Arctic continues to warm, soils might not retain as much water as the subsurface ice that held it in place gradually gives way, she noted. How much of it makes it into the atmosphere is the big thing, Comain said. Ecosystems will probably produce more methane as they stay wet. The big question we have is how much of that makes it into the atmosphere, and I don't think they get to that question here. Again, just a very grim reminder that methane breaks down into carbon dioxide, boom, 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 which is not good. One way or the other, it is a bad, bad, bad thing. I'm going to end this video on some sandbox news, but this is positive sandbox news, and this is Bernie Sanders, one lone, sane voice. He's not the only voice in the political realm, but one of the loudest and one of the largest, and one of the most welcome in my mind. And I'm just going to continue to say that. Who knows where the future takes us, but hopefully if the Democratic Party knows what's good for itself, this man will be the nominee and not some corporate stooge fool. In Call for Peace address, Bernie Sanders takes on endless war and global oligarchy. This is from Truth Out from yesterday. In a wide-ranging speech viewed by more than 11,000 people from over 30 countries, Senator Bernie Sanders on Sunday commemorated the 15th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq by highlighting its devastating consequences and issuing an urgent call for a global agenda that pursues peace, not war, and development, not destruction. We need to invest in our children, in our elderly, and in healthcare and education and environmental protection. We do not want more and more war, Sanders says. People in my country, the United States, and all over the world are sick and tired of spending billions and billions of dollars on nuclear weapons, warplanes, missiles, bombs, and tanks. Thank you, Bernie Sanders. Sanders, who was joined on Sunday at the Call for Peace event by Korea expert and peace activist Christine Ahn, Raid Jarar of Amnesty International, and Jenny Town of the U.S. Korea Institute, also used his speech to highlight global crises ranging from human-caused climate change to the rise of oligarchy. Increasingly in the United States and around the world, we see an economic and political system in which a small number of multi-billionaires and corporate interests have increased control over the world's economic life, our political life, and our media, Sanders said. Inequality, corruption, oligarchy, and authoritarianism are inseparable. They must be understood as part of the same system and fought and opposed in the same way. These are crises that can only be solved through international cooperation, not unilateral action by powerful nations, Sanders argues. The threat of climate change is a very clear example of why we all need to pull together. We are in this together. The United States can't do it alone. Europe can't do it alone. China can't do it alone. No one country can do this alone, Sanders concluded. This is a crisis that calls out for a strong international cooperation if we are to leave our children and our grandchildren a planet that is healthy and habitable. A video of Sanders' speech can be viewed below. Sanders' address begins at around the 36-minute mark. A full transcript of the speech follows the embedded video. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to maybe just kind of traipse through the transcripts. Let me thank you very much, and let me thank Move On for helping to organize this event, and thank all the people throughout the world for coming together. I think today we are here to mark a very somber anniversary, and that is the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. 15 years ago, this week, the bombs started falling on Baghdad. Shock and awe was what the Bush administration called it, and the news media repeated it, creating the expectation that U.S. military power would make the war quick and easy. We all remember that. The theory was that Saddam Hussein would be overthrown in a few weeks. Democracy in Iraq would be established, American troops would return home in a few months, and everything would be wonderful from then on out. Well, it didn't quite happen like that. Later, we all would be shocked and awed at the disaster that we had created, because war is never quick and it is never easy. I remember vividly, I was in Congress at the time, all the rhetoric that came from the Bush administration, that came from my Republican colleagues and some Democrats as well. HRC. About why going to war in Iraq was the right thing to do. Well, it wasn't. In fact, it was one of the great tragedies in modern history. It is very easy to give speeches in the safety of the floor of the Senate or in the House. It is a little bit harder to experience war and live through the devastation of war and to deal with the aftermath, the consequences. I was one of those that opposed the war at the beginning. Today, it is now broadly acknowledged that the war in Iraq was a foreign policy blunder of enormous magnitude. And not to mention, we are still in Afghanistan. Why? For opium, actually, among other things. The war created a cascade of instability around the region that we are still dealing with today in Syria and elsewhere, and will be for many years to come. Indeed, had it not been for the Iraq War, ISIS would almost certainly not exist. The war deepened hostilities between Sunni and Shia communities in Iraq and elsewhere. It exacerbated a regional struggle for power between Saudi Arabia and Iran and their proxies in places like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And it undermined American diplomatic efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The devastation experienced by Iraq's civilians was unbelievable. A recent academic study by U.S., Canadian, and Iraqi researchers found that over 400,000 Iraqi civilians, nearly 500,000 people, were killed directly or indirectly as a consequence of the war. Note, other researchers have estimated that the total number of deaths from the war exceeds 1 million. The war led to the deaths of some 4,400 U.S. troops and the wounding, physical and emotional, of tens of thousands of others. The war led to the displacement of nearly 5 million people, both inside and outside of Iraq, putting great stress on the ability of surrounding countries to deal with these refugee flows. We've also seen this more recently in Europe, as large numbers of people fleeing the Syrian war has generated a backlash in European countries, giving rise to anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant sentiments that have been exploited by right-wing politicians. Donald Trump. And by the way, that war, and Theresa May, and dare I say, Angela Merkel. By the way, that war in Iraq cost trillions of dollars, money that could have been, I know Angela Merkel is not right wing, but I think they're dealing with immigration in Germany in not a very good way, France as well. By the way, that war in Iraq cost trillions of dollars, money that could have been spent on addressing the massive levels of poverty and hopelessness that exist all over the developing world, where hundreds of millions of people today live in extreme poverty and where many children around the world die as a result of easily prevented diseases. The Iraq war, like so many other military conflicts, has had unintended consequences and ended up making us less safe, not more safe. The Iraq war also set a precedent, a very dangerous precedent, that large countries like the United States would attack small countries with impunity. Instead of moving us forward to a world without war, where international conflicts are settled through negotiations and diplomacy, we now see wars all over the world and a significant increase in global military spending. For example, right here in the United States, Congress just voted to increase the Defense Department budget by $165 billion over a 2-year period. No one disagrees that Saddam Hussein was a brutal, murderous dictator, United States puppet for many, many years, so whatever. But it's not known that he had nothing to do with 9/11. It is now known that he had nothing to do with 9/11. The American people were misled by the Bush administration into believing that the Iraq war was necessary to prevent another 9/11. 40 years before that, in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson cited an attack on the U.S. ship in the Gulf of Tonkin as a pretext for escalating U.S. intervention in Vietnam. Oh my God. We now know that his administration misled both Congress and the American people into that war, just as the Bush administration did in Iraq. Yes, thank you, Bernie Sanders, for mentioning the fact that the Gulf of Tonkin was a false flag, was a pretext, was completely made up as a pretext for us going to the Vietnam War. If y'all don't believe that false flags don't exist, or if you don't believe that false flags exist, this is a very clear case of a false flag that the U.S. Has admitted to, has recognized, was a false pretense for going into the Vietnam War, which was a terrible, terrible loss of life and a terrible blow to the environment. Time and time again, we see disasters when leaders refuse to tell their people the truth. And let's remember that the people of the world were not silent about the Iraq war. I mean, let me just rewind and say that he stopped short of, the pretext for going into Iraq was WMDs, was this weapons of mass destruction. But the actual pretext for going into the war was 9/11. And we all know what a massive false flag that was. In the months leading up to the invasion, there were huge, unprecedented demonstrations in the United States and, in fact, all over the world opposing that war. The truth is that in country after country, what people were saying is that we need to invest in our children, in our elderly, and in healthcare and education and environmental protection. We do not want more and more war. people in my, blah, blah, blah. Hold on. I read this in the preamble. People in my country, the United States, and all over the world are sick and tired of spending billions and millions of dollars on nuclear weapons, warplanes, missiles, bombs, and tanks. Our job together in each of our countries is to bring our people together around an agenda that calls for peace, not war, development, not destruction. Let me say a brief word about some of the shared global challenges that we face today. The growth of oligarchy and income and wealth inequality is not just an American issue, it is a global issue. Globally, the top 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 99% of the world's population. Increasingly in the United States and around the world, we see an economic and political system which a small number of multi-billionaires and corporate interests have increased control of the world's economic life, our political life, and our media. And these people are working night and day just to make themselves even richer. Donald Trump. Just a few years ago, it was estimated that the wealthiest people and the most profitable corporations in the world have stashed at least $21 trillion in offshore tax havens to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. The situation has become so absurd that one 5-story building in the Cayman Islands, which has a 0% corporate tax rate, is now the home of nearly 20,000 companies. In other words, while the very, very rich become much richer, governments around the world institute austerity programs because they lack the funds to provide decently for the constituents. Inequality, corruption, oligarchy, and authoritarianism are inseparable. They must be understood as part of the same system and fought and opposed in the same way. Around the world, we have witnessed the rise of demagogues who, once in power, use their position to loot the state of its resources. These kleptocrats like Putin and Russia and many others use divisiveness and abuse as a tool for enriching themselves and those loyal to them. The last years have obviously seen very troubling political developments in many countries around the world, particularly in Europe and also here in the United States. The rise of intolerant, authoritarian political movements is something that should concern each and every one of us. These movements have drawn strength from the fact that more and more people have lost faith in their systems of government and are desperate for alternatives. They see their governments as corrupt and ineffective and not delivering for them or providing opportunities for a better future for their children. The problem is when you see leaders that tell the people, only I can deliver you security, opportunity, and a future, it's those people over there that are taking it away from you. I wonder who he is referencing there. They point to politically unpopular groups, ethnic and religious minorities, immigrants, refugees, and blame these groups for all the trouble and then propose to strip these groups of their rights. That is how demagogues work. They gain power by claiming to speak to people's legitimate desires, but always end up using that power to oppress them. They claim to speak for the many, but really represent the very few. We have seen this played out before many times in history. Further, we cannot forget when we talk about global crisis, the crisis of climate change. My friends, it is time for us to get serious about this issue. The scientific community is virtually unanimous in telling us that climate change is real. It is caused by human activity. It is already causing devastating harm throughout the world. Further, what the scientists tell us is that if we do not act boldly together to address the crisis of climate change, this planet will see more drought, more floods, and more types of devastation. Furthermore, what we will see is a level of migration of people moving away from areas where they cannot grow foods or drinkable water, which will cause all kinds of other threats to global stability and security. The threat of climate change is a very clear example of why we all need to pull together. We are in this together. The United States can't do it alone. Europe can't do it alone. China can't do it alone. And no one country can do this alone. This is a crisis that calls out for strong international cooperation if we are to leave our children and our grandchildren a planet that is healthy and habitable. So let me just conclude by again thanking all of you who are watching this program, who understand that we need to stand together to rally the people for social, economic, political, and racial justice, and that the only way we are going to solve international problems is when people throughout the world come together. Beautiful. Bernie Sanders. Ladies and gentlemen, speaking truth, speaking truth, and he is possibly one of the few people who are in a position to change the course in an immediate sense, to change the course of our future and possibly history. So let us let us do what we can to either support this man or support people like him, support people who are in his realm of progressive thinking. It's interesting because I've seen a few clips of a Donald Trump speech lately that kind of echoed like the same sentiments. It's like he took Bernie Sanders' ideas and regurgitated them back at people, and everybody was like, yeah. The problem is that he doesn't say anything about climate change, and he doesn't say anything about racial equality or about, any, economic inequality. He doesn't, there's a lot of gaps in Donald Trump's message or in his campaign message. And there are even bigger gaps in his actual policies that he's putting forth as president. It's, he's basically the handmaiden for the wealthy and for the global corporate elite to keep on devouring the planet and keep on escalating wealth inequality and keep on driving that gap, that ever widening gap between the rich and the poor, and the poor are going to suffer. So let's hope that this administration goes out, one and out, very, very soon. And let's hope that somebody with some sanity can get us at least on some kind of path forward. That's all I have for this video tonight. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, your conscience. If you would like to donate to this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until tomorrow, peace.